The drone of the ventilation system was Reid's constant companion, a low, industrial hum that had long since faded into the background static of his life. He pushed another stack of reports across his desk, the fluorescent lights of the accounting office casting a sickly yellow glow on the columns of numbers. Days bled into weeks, each one a meticulous ledger of predictable tasks, a quiet, determined grind that suited him. He found a certain comfort in the order, the absolute certainty of figures adding up, of debits and credits balancing. It was a world entirely devoid of surprises. Then came the call. It was a Tuesday, just after lunch, when his desk phone, usually reserved for inter-office queries, chirped with an unfamiliar external line. He answered, a polite, practiced professionalism in his voice. The caller introduced himself as a solicitor, his tone gravely formal, his words precise and unhurried. He spoke of an inheritance, an unexpected bequest from a distant relative Reid barely remembered, a man named Alastair Finch. The name felt like a relic, unearthed from a forgotten corner of his childhood, a whisper of an old man who had lived somewhere far away, shrouded in family myth. Mr. Finch passed away quite suddenly, the solicitor explained, a dry rustle of papers audible on his end. Under unusual circumstances. He left everything to you, Reid. Primarily, a property. Reid felt a prickle of unease. Unusual circumstances. The phrase hung in the air, heavy and vague. He hadn't seen or spoken to Alastair Finch in decades, not since a single, awkward family gathering when he was a boy, a memory so faint it might have been a dream. Why him? The solicitor continued, detailing the property, a cabin, deep within a forgotten forest, several hours' drive from any major town. Remote, isolated. The words conjured images of moss-draped trees and an oppressive silence, a stark contrast to the sterile hum of his office. Reid, despite his initial apprehension, felt a flicker of something else, curiosity, perhaps, or a determined urge to understand this abrupt disruption to his ordered existence. He agreed to visit, to see this inheritance. He had to. The journey began with the familiar sprawl of highways, then narrowed to country roads, eventually dissolving into a gravel track that wound like a scar through an ever-thickening canopy of trees. His phone's signal dwindled, then vanished entirely. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp scent of ancient earth and decaying leaves. Reid gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The city, his life of predictable numbers, felt impossibly far away. He passed a landmark the solicitor had mentioned, a colossal, skeletal structure of rust-eaten metal and broken windows, looming through the trees like a forgotten titan. It was a derelict factory, vast and decaying, its empty shell echoing with the ghosts of forgotten industry. The sight sent a shiver down his spine, a premonition of deeper decay ahead. The air here felt different, heavier, as if the forest itself held its breath. The track finally opened into a small, overgrown clearing. There it stood, half swallowed by the encroaching wilderness, the cabin. It was ancient, certainly, its timber walls a weathered gray, the roof sagging like a tired shoulder. A single, gnarled oak, impossibly old, stood sentinel beside it, its branches twisted into grotesque shapes, its roots like grasping fingers pushing up through the packed earth. Reid killed the engine. The sudden absence of sound was deafening. This place felt less like an inheritance and more like a challenge, a heavy secret waiting to be unearthed. A profound sense of isolation washed over him, not just from civilization, but from time itself. He was alone, utterly, completely alone, and the cabin seemed to watch him, waiting. The solicitor concluded his perfunctory delivery, his voice flat as he pushed a heavy brass key across the polished desk. Reid picked it up, the metal cool and surprisingly weighty in his palm. He nodded, mumbled a strained thank you, and then found himself navigating the bustling city streets, the key a solid anchor against the swirling uncertainty in his mind. Unusual circumstances. The phrase echoed, a low thrum beneath the din of traffic, a premonition he couldn't quite shake. The drive was long, stretching from the orderly grid of urban sprawl to the winding, shadowed lanes that eventually gave way to a dense, forgotten forest. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. When the cabin finally appeared, a hunched silhouette against the bruised sky, it was exactly as he'd pictured, isolated, ancient, almost swallowed whole by the encroaching wilderness. Its windows, dark and unblinking, seemed to watch him as he killed the engine. He pushed open the heavy front door, the hinges groaning in protest. Dust motes danced in the sparse light filtering through grimy panes, illuminating a space that felt less like a home and more like a tomb. The air inside was still, thick with the smell of decay, old wood, and something else, a faint, metallic tang he couldn't quite place. Reid dropped his duffel bag, the thud echoing unnaturally in the quiet. He spent the first hours simply opening windows, letting the cool, clean forest air attempt to purge the cabin's stagnant breath. As dusk settled, painting the forest in shades of violet and deep blue, Reid began to unpack. He moved slowly, methodically, trying to impose some order on the chaos of inherited disuse. He stacked canned goods in a rickety pantry, laid out his sleeping bag on a cot he'd unfolded in the main room. The cabin settled around him, a symphony of creaks and groans that he initially dismissed as the natural complaints of an old structure. The wind, he told himself, was merely playing tricks on the loose boards and rattling panes. A floorboard groaned behind him. Reid spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron poker by the hearth. Nothing. He frowned, his brow furrowed. Must have been the house settling. He turned back to his task, only to find the small, leather-bound book he'd been holding a moment before now lay on the floor, several feet from where he'd placed it. He hadn't dropped it. He was sure of it. He picked it up, a prickle of unease tracing its way up his spine. Just tired, he thought, rubbing his temples. Long drive. Later, as he tried to start a fire in the hearth, a faint scraping sound came from the kitchen, like something being dragged across the rough floorboards. He froze, listening intently. It stopped. He walked to the kitchen, peering into the gloom. Nothing seemed disturbed. He told himself it was just his imagination, amplified by the isolation. Still, he found himself checking the locks on the doors and windows, a habit he hadn't possessed before arriving. The following day, determined to properly explore his new, unsettling inheritance, Reid began to systematically clear out the cabin. He found little of value, mostly moth-eaten textiles, rusted tools, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. In what seemed to be a study, tucked away behind a built-in bookshelf, he discovered a loose panel. His fingers fumbled with the aged wood, eventually prying it open. It was unlocked. He lifted the lid, revealing not jewels or deeds, but a collection of brittle photographs and a single, leather-bound journal. The photographs were sepia-toned, depicting stern-faced men and women in antiquated clothing, their eyes holding a peculiar, almost haunted intensity. One photograph, in particular, caught his eye, a group of men standing before a massive, crumbling structure. It was unmistakably a factory, its skeletal remains reaching towards a gray sky. Below it, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "The derelict factory, where the pact was forged." Reid's breath hitched. He knew of no factory in the immediate vicinity, let alone one tied to his family. He set the photographs aside and picked up the journal. Its pages, though aged, were filled with a precise, almost frantic script. He opened it to a random page, his eyes scanning the faded ink. "The land demands its due. We thought the offering at the derelict factory would appease it, seal the bargain, but it only opened the door. The forest itself breathes with a hunger now. Alistair, my brother, speaks of escape, but there is no escaping the bloodline's debt." Alistair. The name echoed, connecting the cryptic words to the distant relative he barely knew, the man whose unusual circumstances had brought him here. The journal slipped from his fingers, landing with a soft thud on the dusty floor. He stared at the open page, the words blurring before his eyes. The creaks and groans of the cabin, which he'd rationalized as mere age, now seemed to carry a different weight, a more sinister intent. They were the house, the forest, something else, stirring. And it knew his name. The name, Alistair, had been a cold shard in Reid's mind, cutting through the thin veil of his skepticism. The journal, a relic of a life he barely touched, lay open on the floorboards, its faded ink screaming a silent warning. He hadn't known what to make of the cryptic entry, "The blood, Alistair, it demands its due," but it resonated with a chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's drafty corners. The air thickened around him, pressing against his skin, a presence that had been subtle before, now almost palpable. The quiet, which had once felt like solitude, now felt like a held breath. Old house, settling, trick of the light. But the small, carved wooden bird, a dust-laden trinket from the mantel, had been on the floor this morning, nestled beside his boot. He'd stared at it, the tiny wooden eyes seeming to mock his disbelief. Then came the sounds. Not the wind, not the creaks. He'd held his breath, straining to decipher them, but they always dissolved into nothingness just as he felt on the cusp of understanding. One evening, a distinct thump asterisk from the floor above, directly over his head, jolted him upright. He descended the creaking stairs, a heavy iron poker clutched in his hand, only to find the upstairs bedroom undisturbed, save for a single, small window pane that had somehow swung inward, despite being latched. A gust of frigid air rushed in, carrying with it a scent, damp earth and something else, something metallic and ancient, like rust in old blood. He could no longer deny it. Something was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. He had to understand. He started with Alistair's journal, poring over its delicate pages, his fingers tracing the looping script. A desperate one, but a lead nonetheless. Reid packed a small bag, his laptop, and a camera. The elderly archivist, a woman with spectacles perched on her nose like a bird, offered little beyond general histories of the region. That cabin, she'd mused, her voice thin as parchment, always been a strange one. Built on land that was, well, never quite right. She spoke of old rumors, of landowners who never stayed long, of strange occurrences, but nothing concrete. No mention of Alistair or a pact. His frustration mounted, but Alistair's journal had pointed him to a specific location, a derelict factory on the outskirts of the nearest forgotten settlement. The coordinates were scrawled on a loose page tucked between entries about the lineage. The factory stood like a skeletal giant against the bruised sky, its windows shattered eyes, its brickwork crumbling like ancient teeth. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay, dust, and something else, a faint, sickly sweet odor that made his stomach clench. Light filtered through gaping holes in the roof, illuminating motes of dust dancing in lazy spirals. He found what he was looking for in a disused office, tucked away behind a collapsed filing cabinet, a wooden crate, surprisingly intact, bearing a faded stencil of the family crest. Inside, a collection of documents, brittle land deeds dating back centuries, old newspaper clippings detailing disappearances and unexplained phenomena in the region, and a series of letters, written in a hand that mirrored Alistair's, but older, much older. The letters, dated from the late 1700s, spoke of a sacred trust, a debt to the earth, and a binding agreement. They detailed rituals, sacrifices of blood and bone to appease the Ancient One that slept beneath the land. One letter, stained with what looked like dried rust, explicitly mentioned the construction of the cabin, a vessel to honor the pact, a focal point for the lineage's duty. Reid's breath hitched. A lineage of sacrifice. This wasn't just Alistair's madness, it was a generational curse. The words "blood demands its due" echoed in his mind, no longer cryptic, but terrifyingly clear. He scanned a faded family tree, his finger tracing lines of descent, finally landing on his own name, neatly penned in Alistair's hand, directly beneath the previous custodian of the pact. He was next. The cabin wasn't just a house, it was a trap, and he, Reid, was the chosen offering.